What's up, guys? We're back with another Seeing Through Gebser. We are finishing up our last subsection in this giant section of manifestations of the aperspectival world. We're going to finish literature. I was going to split this up into two videos, but you guys have been so patient. Thank you so much for that I'm just going to finish it all today. So let's see if we can get into it. Last week we did a quick little recap of all the different grammatical changes that signal an emerging integral consciousness. So let's just do another recap. Number one, let's just read Gebser. We are concerned here with the novel employment of certain grammatical categories which fundamentally reveal the new consciousness structure. These include A, the adjective and the adverb, B, the substantivation of the infinitive, C, the rejection of because or since, D, the rejection of as or like, which is a simile, modification of the comparative degree, beginnings with and, as well as G, the new rhyme. So these are the things we're going to be covering in this video. This is Gebser. The most noticeable change has occurred since Romanticism in the usage of adjectives. Until Classicism, the adjective was used to modify the substantive, and often lent things an anthropomorphic character, depriving them of their independence and subordinating them to a perspectival anthropocentrism. The quote-unquote furious or quote-unquote courageous sword and similar formulations of that epoch are familiar to everyone. Or it was used as an quote-unquote adorning attribute, as in classical antiquity, although it has been overlooked until now that the allied Athena, for example, is a numinous description and not at all an adornment. This is a problem with Gebser. We're talking about adjectives, and then he throws in this claim about the allied Athena not being an adjective and being a numinous ascription. Is that just your opinion? First of all, what does that have to do with anything? Two, is that just your opinion, or are you hiding behind I've integrated objective and subjective, so therefore all my subjective opinions are actually objective. Okay. Since Romanticism, the adjective has been losing its meaning as a mere descriptive term and has become a relational word. So the traditional rational mental perspectival way of employing an adjective has two functions. One, lending things an anthropomorphic character, and two, as an adorning attribute. It is a mere descriptive term and is no longer a mere descriptive term and is now becoming a relational word. So that was the mental way of doing things. Now we're doing the integral, where all that melts down, gets liquefied, and instead the adjective is a relational word now. This is most saliently expressed where adverbs are changed into adjectives, as for example in Kafka's phrase, quote, and while greeting, he stepped into the lateral grass. Ever since Hölderlin and Heinrich Heine, examples of the new aperspectival use of adjectives can be found in Kafka, Trakl, Valery, Rilke, Quasimodo, and Jorge Guillen. Okay. Give me 1 second. All right. In all these instances, the one-sided rigidity is superseded. Instead of the previous reference of the adjective to one substantive, the attribute now emphasizes the relationship among things and is effective in all directions. An action is no longer observed from the standpoint of the subject, but also from the object. Kafka no longer says, quote, and while greeting, stepped laterally into the grass, but, quote, and while greeting, stepped into the lateral grass, unquote. The temporal, quote-unquote, stepped moves in close relationship with the spatial, quote-unquote, lateral grass. Space and time are joined. The relationship is no longer determined adverbially from one side with reference only to the object, but also adjectively with reference to the world, for in this instance, the lateral grass is the world. Give me 1 second, I want to read ahead. Point to the change of a subject. Okay, so let's just go through that paragraph because that's pretty dense. We'll go through it line by line. In all these instances, the one-sided rigidity is superseded. That should be a sign for you guys that the mental structure is on its way out, not only in rationalism, insofar as we can only view things from the mental structure's perspective, but also this idea that, you posit one thing that's measurable known against the other. We have one perspective against the other, and we privilege one over the other. Both of those, in that sense, are gone. Instead of the previous reference of the adjective to one substantive, the attribute now emphasizes the relationship amongst things and is effective in all directions. So rather than being effective in just one direction, the mental, we are effective in all directions insofar as the mythical, the magical, and the integral. That same principle is being applied to English. Now this is where it gets good. An action is no longer observed from the standpoint of the subject, but also from the object. We can see the rationalism right here. We have subject versus object, and then, of course, we privilege, in this case, subject over object. Now, why would we do that? Well, of course, the subject, that's a reference to what? The strong I, the strong sense of I, the strong ego. And that's obviously a part of the mental structure. And rationalism presupposes that the ego goes way too far to the point of just everything is the subject, everything is the individual. We're done with that. So the action is no longer being observed from the subject's perspective exclusively. That is a huge, huge sign that grammatically we are transcending the mental perspectival way of doing things. Kafka no longer says, and while greeting, stepped laterally into the grass. But, and while greeting, stepped into the lateral grass. So from the subject's standpoint, if we're employing an adjective to either describe something as an adorning tribute, to lend something an anthropomorphic character, from the perspective of the subject, we all care about ourselves. The subject doesn't care about the object, cares about the subject. So the adjective is going to describe and add a qualitative sort of stamp to the actions of the subject, right? So stepping laterally is describing what the subject is doing. That's the traditional mental way of doing things because everything's so solipsistic and narcissistic. But Kafka switches this. He says, rather than stepping laterally into the grass, he says, stepped into the lateral grass. So the qualitative aspect is no longer attributed to the subject, but to the object. And in doing so, it brings the object back up in balance with the subject. No longer are we viewing things exclusively from the subject, but also from the perspective of the object, as evidenced by our employment of adjectives. And here's another aspect. The temporal quote-unquote stepped moves in close relationship with the spatial quote-unquote lateral grass. Space and time are conjoined. So when we stepped into the lateral grass, like he said, stepped is, well, that's an action word. That, of course, if it's an action word, then it must unfold according to some sort of movement, and all movement unfolds according to time. And that gets moved into close relation with the traditionally understood dead static grass. So the temporal aspect, which stepped, is no longer being viewed just in terms of the subject, but also the supposedly dead object. So now space and time are closer conjoined in English. The relationship is no longer determined adverbially from one side with reference only to the object, but also adjectively with reference to the world. For in this instance, the lateral grass is the world. So pretty cool. The new usage of adjective, Redo R. Bizzola has defined it as adjectival ambivalence, and the attribute dissolving element points to the change valuation of the subject. This altered valuation is also visible in the increasing substantivation of the verb and its infinitival form. Since the substantive can be considered to be the static, and substantive is a noun, by the way, I don't know if I mentioned that. Since the substantive can be considered to be the static, noun, person, place, or thing, and the verb the actuating element of a sentence, the new use of the substantive indicates an activation of the substantive and a resolution of the opposites and relates the fixed, the static, to the temporal in the closest way possible. So this is what I'm talking about. By trying to combine or integrate words that denote dead, static, spatial objects with adjectives, adverbs have been changed to adjectives because adverbs are no longer describing what the subject is doing. It's describing the quote-unquote dead, or the traditionally viewed dead, world. And by employing it on the dead world, it becomes livened, and it's brought into a balance with the subject. And in doing so, we conjoin space and time. The movement that presupposes time is conjoined with the dead space. While the new employment of the adjective and the substantivation of the infinitive structurally resolve perspectival rigidity, rejection of quote-unquote because expresses the extrication from the exclusive claim of causal thinking. By rejection of because, we mean the stylistic peculiarity and the new poetry tending to avoid because or since, conjunctions that have always established reasons in terms of the causal nexus. Their avoidance reflects a recognition of a causality and an insight into the ever-present manifold aspectuality of possible relations and interdependencies. Whew! So obviously, when you use the word because, well, the word in there is cause, and cause relates to the mental structure. And you see this in writing all the time, by the way. By the way, just go on Substack, go on the whatever, New York Times or whatever. You always replace it with a colon. That's what I like to do in my Substack articles. I didn't realize I was being a based integral thinker. Their avoidance reflects, we just did that, replacement of the quote-unquote because by a colon, there you go, for example, is a frequent stylistic device in modern literature found in Hopkins and used subsequently not only by T.S. Eliot but by other poets, and occurs with increasing frequency even in prose. What we some years ago called the rejection of simile is also symptomatic for the new consciousness structure. In one of his letters from the time of the First World War, Rilke rejected the usage of like and as. The same rejection later occurs in the work of Paul Eluard. The simile being always a systemization. Now, of course, systemizations, that's mental structure stuff. The simile, that is what it tries to do. It tries to systemize things, so we're trying to transcend that. Is experienced as a lie. The perpetual one-sided, rigidifying determination inherent in the use of as/like can no longer be endured by an understanding that has transcended exclusive systemization. Every postulation of likeness or similarity, insofar as it is a postulation, is experienced as a violation. The rejection of simile in the new poetry expresses the systatic element and the awareness that the concern can be only with interrelationships and not with likeness. So when you say it is as hot as hell, for example, as Gebser would put it, anytime you do that, let me see 1 second. It's perpetually one-sided, and it's a rigidifying determination. So it is hot as hell. It is not hot as anything else, and it is only hot as hell, at least insofar as you are positing that. Rather, when you say it could be hot a hot as hell, it could be hot as all these other things. And I think that's the integral way forward. They're not doing this simple, one-sided, perspectively rigid, you are like this, you are like that, because, like I said, you are taking this and you are positing all other alternatives in an either-or causal logical way of doing things, which will necessarily run you astray. Just like everything else mental structure, it only gives you a fragment. When you say it's hot as hell outside, yeah, that might be true, but again, it could be hot as other things as well, and that is expressed in poetry. Now, in the everyday language, yeah, if you say it's hot as hell, not only is everyone going to know what that means, but we're also going to think that makes complete sense. But in the new poetry, in the new literature, you will see changes. The quote-unquote rejection, actually, no, we're going to skip that part. Okay. A similar emphasis on context is expressed in the new stylistic peculiarity of beginnings with quote-unquote and, that is akin to the recurrent use of and endings by James Joyce, for example. Hugo von Hofmannsthal's Ballad of External Life begins with the line, and children grow up with deep eyes. Federico Garcia Lorca's romantic ballad, The Unfaithful Wife, starts with an and. Y que yo me la llevé al río, and I carried her to the river. Sentences beginning with and in the new prose have become commonplace. There, the quote-unquote and is not required to enumerate or sum up or even to intimate such functions. That's the traditional function of the perspectival use or employment of the word and. To enumerate or sum up or to even intimate such functions. This new and its novel usage emphasizes interconnections which are not exhausted in enumerative and narrative sequential thought and its summation of parts. Beautiful. I'm going to repeat that just for emphasis. This new and its novel usage emphasizes interconnections which are not exhausted in enumerative and narrative sequential thought and its summation of parts. So that's a pretty good description of the mental structure's viewing of, I guess, grammar and syntax and all that stuff. A poem, for instance, is not placed in space as a self-contained and thus spatially limited construction, but rather participates in the whole. Its quote-unquote and beginning joins with the invisible, to which it communicates visibility and audibility throughout the poem. The everlasting plentitude of an event is not sectored or perspectively fixed. So when you start a poem and you write it out and you post it and all that stuff, what Gebser's saying is you're positing it as a statically fixed phenomenon. But when you start with the word and, that presupposes that the visible postulation here is connected to something else invisible, because the visible is just the yang to the invisible's yin. When you start with and, it makes it seem like, well, there was some other things that were going on that have been hidden to us in this poem. So that's a way of integrating the visible with the invisible by simply just starting with the word and. It's very cool. And it reminds me of the new, if you know the band Truck Violence, they're kind of an obscure indie band. They just released a new album. I don't love it, honestly. I prefer their first album. The song Lecture, that's a white boy summer right there. But if you go listen to the first song on the new Truck Violence album, it really does feel like when you play it, it's just, whoa, we're already in the middle of a song. And it's super cool because it makes you feel like you're participating in something bigger than just the poem. Just like with integral consciousness, not only do we just have the mental structure, we also have the mythical and magical as well, and the integral. Not only do we just have space, but we also have space-time. Well, not only do we have just the visible poem, but by adding and, we have its invisible substrate, which is just, I don't know, I think it's kind of cool. Let's see. Rather, the artistic and stylistic device expresses the open structure of being. That's another thing. It opens it too. Because when you write your little poem, it doesn't start with and, like I said, with the static permanence of it. Everything is closed. Everything is fixed. But now it's open. There's a whole new world out here. And that openness, of course, corresponds to the new openness that emerges with integral consciousness in all these domains. A parallel can be found in the new music, for example, in Manuel de Falla's ballet The Three-Cornered Hat, which begins right in the very middle of its principal theme. Let us also recall that the quote-unquote and beginnings and endings in James Joyce, for example, correspond to a characteristic of modern music. As Krennic points out, the new music is music quote-unquote without beginning or end. The and acquires a new value, and by doing so, alters the structure of language. Instead of being a knot splicing the thread of a story, it becomes the word of plentitude. Pretty freaking cool, in my opinion. Okay. The same reevaluation of once insignificant words is reflected in the new rhyme. Not only the copula quote-unquote and, but, in marked contrast to the usage of classicism, the articles, relative pronouns, predispositions, conjunctions, adjectives, adverbs, etc. are used as rhyme words. Rilke rhymes und with mund, or and with mouth. Mallarmé rhymes mains, few, with demains, tomorrow. And at the, with, or o, with numero. Edith Sitwell rhymes these with trees, and Verlaine rhymes de la with Allah, to cite a few among scores of examples. Just as each color is of equal value in modern painting, the maxima of the new painting since the turn of the century, so is each word of the poem in the new poetry of equal importance. There are no more filler or makeshift words, just as in painting transitional expedient colors are excluded. The fact that no one part is over or undervalued, as was true in perspectival poetry and painting, and that the constant validity of the whole excludes emphasis of any part, lends this mode of rhyming its aperspectival imprint. Thus it must not be confused with the rhyme mannerism of the Baroque, in which Gongora excelled. Its mode of rhyming is an ecstatic and playful emergence from the strictness of the Renaissance. So that's a very, very, very important point. We all know the rational, one against the other, privilege one over the other. Emphasis on one. Gebser is saying that the new poetry, the new English, says that literally every single word is as equally important as the other. There are no makeshift words. There are no transitions. There is no, let's put this against this, and then that's that. Every single word is paid its own respect. And that, he believes, is a change from the perspectival one-sided nature. Because now the one becomes the whole. Let's see. Now, having attempted to answer the question of time's effectuality in poetry, the other two questions dealing with the supersession of dualism and with irrationality have been implicitly answered by the preceding discussion. So, too, it may be argued that the attentive reader of this section will have noticed before now that the answer to the question of time will have more or less included an answer to the other questions. It shows the urgency and the key position attributed to time. Moreover, it shows that the acceptance of the fourth dimension, even in its pre-form of multifarious systases and temporic attempts, logically and naturally incorporates the supersession of dualism and the achievement of irrationality. Let's just skip ahead a little bit to point number 2. Point number 2, the supersession of dualism in new poetry is reflected by the structurally changed usage of certain sentence elements as noted above. Through the transvaluation of the subject, evident in the new usage of the adjective and in the substantivation of the infinitive, its position to the object in the world is freed from the previous dualism. The novel use of the comparative renounces an antithetical relationship, while the rejection of the quote-unquote because frees thought from rational causality without regressing into irrationality. So since causality includes in its structure dualism, it too is surpassed by the rejection of simile. So we already kind of covered this. Remember, we already transcended the dualism of subject and object. No longer are we viewing things just from the view of the subject, but also subject and object. That's a perfect example. No longer are we employing adjectives, which sort of lighten and liven the world only in terms of the subject's actions or whatever. Now, adverbs are being transformed to adjectives so that their qualitative emphasis can be attributed to dead spatial phenomena, which increases its, status and brings it into balance with the subject. That's two great examples right there. And then, of course, as we just covered, the visible and invisible aspect, beginning with the word and. That's another one. And we've also rejected causality because now we've replaced because with the colon. And now we have a full plenitude of associations to make. We shall not attempt to proceed thematically here with our demonstration by adducing individual utterances of the above-mentioned poets. We can say in general, however, that the technique of portraying everything in black and white, of an imprisonment in pathos, of a purposive and merely descriptive rendering, can be found ever less frequently in their work. Magic and myth, on the other hand, are flourishing with astonishing purity among those poets who have authentically surpassed the mental rational structure. As an example to illuminate this supersession, we would cite only the new attitude towards death. It can be said that it begins with one of the latest utterances of Hölderlin. Quote, life is death, and death is also a life. Tell me if you've heard that before. It is also intimated in Hugo von Hofmannsthal's Andreas, probably the most consummate work in German prose in several generations. In this context, we should not overlook an entry from Hofmannsthal. Hofmannsthal's diary of 1906, quote, for life and death one can gird one's loins, but what is incomprehensible is how both are present at the same time, unquote. We covered this. We will cover it again. A similar attitude is frequently expressed by Paul Valéry, based in the statement of 1913, quote, death, in the biological sense, forms an indispensable part of life, unquote. By contrast, J. Anker Larsen formulates this attitude even much more clearly in the sense of Hölderlin and Hofmannsthal. Quote, life and death entered being together with me. They are two continuously present sides of this my being in time. Sometimes the one and sometimes the other predominates within me, yet they always work together, and with my being in time they both vanish with me. Whoever has experienced the eternal now, the present, does not see a bottomless abyss between life and death. Here words are again lacking. I can haltingly say, the eternal now is being, and time is existence. Whoever transforms existence into being and has nothing more to do with life and death. Beautiful. While Anker Larsen stresses being, years before the publication of Heidegger's Being and Time, Jacques Chardon, in his statement concerning the problem of life, death, stresses love and not being. Quote, with the writing of Clare, I have attempted to depict perfect love barely troubled by the image of death, or by the insignificant influence of life in persons. Presently, I am inclined to say that not even such shadows are present in perfect love. For them, nothing changes, and the one loved is immutable, outside time and freed from death. Unquote. Yet the most valid expression to date of this attitude towards death is offered by Rilke. His ultimate interpretation is completely mythical polar, yet it transcends the mythical. Quote, listen to this. Death is the inverse, the undescribed side of life. We must attempt to achieve the great awareness of our existence, which resides in both unlimited regions and nourished by both. This true form of life penetrates both regions. The blood of the greatest circulation courses through both. There is neither a here nor a thereafter, but rather the great unity. Like the moon, life too surely has another side turned away from us, yet it is not its opposite, but its complement to perfection, to completeness, to the real, intact, and complete sphere of being. Unquote. So remember when we talked about the soul? The soul is obviously composed of two different parts, the life pole and the death pole. Both are simultaneously present and efficacious. As time unfolds, we cycle through the death pole and the life pole, acquiring knowledge of the soul, acquiring spiritual wisdom that we can spread or transmit to others and improve our lives. Death is not a perspectival succession of life, but a polar complement within which we participate daily. You participate in death when you feel others, when others pass away, in those moments of grief, when you recollect on those moments of grief, when you recollect on your dead friends. And other instances, even every moment of your life is a little miniature death. Literally every moment of your life is a new transformation. No man steps in the same river twice, for he is not the man, and it is not the same river. Even if you cross the river, if you've never crossed the river before, and you cross the river, you now know more than you did before you crossed it. In the same way, one of time's unfoldings is duration, and duration must necessarily mean an accumulation of events, states, beliefs, all that stuff. So therefore, in polar complementary fashion, each new moment is both a birth and death simultaneously. It is the death of the old you with a certain knowledge and the birth of the new you together at once. The tension is held. So that is being expressed beautifully in the new literature, the new poem, the new English. And as long as we don't regress, that's fine. This is Gebser. Here, mythical configuration comes into play in its purity, overdetermined moreover by the integral consciousness. Rilke's image of life and death is in accord with the fundamentally mythical view of the East and contains characteristics which, as we have seen, belong to the mythical structure as such. Death is a constantly present shaded side of life complementing the sun side and forming with it a circular and unlimited course. Hello, 2D flat circle, this mythical consciousness. Richard Wilhelm has brought this to attention by suggesting that both of the Chinese primal principles, yin and yang, the sun-illuminated side and the side away from the sun, the shaded side, are to be understood as sides of one and the same mound. Beautiful. What is new and definitely aperspectival in Rilke follows on his evocation of the mythical configuration and his clear rejection of the rational, which is invalid for this basic phenomenon. Life and death constitute a unity of polar complementarity and are no more mentally conceivable opposites than the here and now and the hereafter. Repeat for emphasis. Life and death constitute a unity of polar complementarity and are no more mentally conceivable opposites than the here and now and the hereafter. The new aperspectival aspect comes forth in Rilke's text, where the image of the mythical circling is overdetermined by the integral volition of the, quote, real, intact, and full sphere of being, unquote. We would note that the mythical configuration is structurally more akin to poetry than the mental. Yet it is rarely expressed with the pure vividness achieved by Rilke, although it underlies his genuine poeticism even when the mental element is employed in the poetic meter. So Gebser is saying poetry and art, myth, all that mainly resides in the mythical structure, but at the same time, you do see elements of the mental structure, which is obvious. There are certain rules of poetry. There's a certain structuring. A haiku has certain lines with certain words. That's the mental structure, obviously. Both the mythical and the mental structures are integrated into the integral irrational structure via the fundamental utterances quoted above. It is significant that both are surpassed, that is, also preserved in the double connotation of the word. Interesting. Number 3, to what extent is irrationality manifest in the new poetry? The rational mutates toward the irrational wherever the eruption of time no longer leads to psychic atomization, but rounds out the systematic completion of systemizations, and wherever quote-unquote time and its complexity no longer serve as dynamizing means of disruption, but are an effectual over-determining element. I'm going to repeat for emphasis because that is such a beautiful way to know if you have survived the, what does he call it, the shipwreck of time or whatever? We sailed the seas of time and you were not shipwrecked. Here's how you know if you've actually made the jump. The rational mutates towards the irrational wherever the eruption of time no longer leads to psychic atomization, right? So anytime time gets in consciousness and it doesn't lead you to just completely destroy yourself psychologically and individually, but rounds out the systematic completion of systemizations, which is to say systemizations belong to the mental structure, and now, complemented and buttressed by time, we can round them out by saying, we don't have to follow a single fragmentary, purely spatial philosophy. By integrating time, we know we can employ it at this time and employ a different spatial system at that time. And wherever quote-unquote time and its complexity no longer serve as dynamizing means of disruption, which is to say, the overwhelming complexity of time destroys you psychologically, but are an effectual over-determining element, which is to say, now that it's safe, it's in here, I can see it now. When you talk about things, you're talking about time as a quality. When you're saying now's not the right time, I understand exactly what that means. And there you go. The description of temporic endeavors in poetry, which avoid relapses into the magical and mythical, have revealed the sudden move, the inceptual mutation toward the irrational. So, of course, as we just covered with Rilke and my little discussion about life and death and polarity, well, as long as you're not regressing so much to the point where you've completely tossed out the mental structure, you've already achieved an irrationality simply by doing that. I mean, if integral consciousness is recognizing the presence and efficaciousness of the magic, mythical, mental, and integral structures, well, we've just done that, haven't we, with that quote by Rilke. Wherever the linguistic structure is freed from the perspectival fixity without reverting to linguistic chaos, initial aperspectival, no longer rational but irrational manifestations are visible. The description of the linguistic structural changes has implicitly shown the new irrational character of language, where the stylistic inversion of rational syntax transforms the sentence, as has happened since Hölderlin, notably in Mallarmé, Rilke, and Eliot, without reverting to irrationalism. The merely rational sequence of tense is surpassed without negating time. The acronon shines forth, and its sustaining in truth presupposes that the rational is not just negated, but over-determined, whereby it necessarily foregoes its claim to exclusivity. But wherever the conceptual, the mental rational world is surpassed, the magical is again audible, the mythical again intuitable. The mental is reduced to its proper sphere of the conceptual, visual, palpable, and demonstrable, and can no longer function obtrusively, but open the path, the leap toward the volition. Let's repeat that again, because now Gebser's laid out beautifully some limits of where the rational should be employed. The mental is reduced to its proper sphere of the conceptual, got it, visible, got it, palpable, got it, and demonstrable. These 4 areas, this is where you employ rational thought, and because we're in 2026, it's like 90% of our world. The audibility, the intuitability, and the conceptuality of the world are overdetermined by the time-free transparency. Since the world is no longer distorted by spatial perspectival visibility and mental conceptuality, this diaphaneity becomes evident as we have seen in the new poetry. Mallarmé excels in such transparency, which Rilke attains now and then. It is prevailingly characteristic of the poetry of Guillen. It constitutes the essence of the later and greatest poems of T.S. Eliot. Yes, I have a series, The Dry Salvages. I think you would enjoy it. It is good for the soul. And is inherent in the intense clarté or clarté in the verses of Valery, whose Faust, as Hoffman notes, describes quote-unquote the secret of the whole, the irrational whole, rather than the merely the rational fragment. Now we have the entirety. In the whole, the spiritual, the diaphanon, becomes perceptible. We have already given evidence that the spiritual transcends psychologization and intellectualization in the new poetry in our remarks on the nature and transformation of poetry. Irrational diaphaneity is a precondition for the sustaining in truth of the spiritual. The new poetry and language contain the initial realizations of this new consciousness capacity. With diaphaneity, the achronon becomes perceptible since diaphaneity itself is achronic. Proust's statement about, quote, freedom from the order of time, unquote, is not a solitary remark. Rilke has said that, quote, wishes are recollections coming from the future. Notice the sphere. Notice the sphere. Wishes are recollections coming from the future. That makes no sense from a traditional rational perspective. But when time is shaped like a sphere and everything closes in on itself, it does begin to make sense because you're not thinking in terms of the future in the sense of, it's July 20th. I'm going to know what happens on July 22nd. But more how the future affects you and how the past affects you, how they are both present and shape your present decision-making. And Lou Albert Lassard, who is the source for this quotation, comments that Rilke intended this to mean, quote, that to a certain extent the future is already contained in the present, and although veiled, it is efficacious. What we call future is just as potent as their so-called past. United in us, they constitute the eternal present. Boom, fucking based. Which is not so much eternal as time-free. That's Gebser. The same achronic attitude speaks to us in Mallarmé's verse, "The star ripens for tomorrow." T.S. Eliot expresses it as, quote, "The things that are to happen have already happened." Beautiful. I love T.S. Eliot. What a boss. Is Gebser. Such statements are not really, quote-unquote, comprehensible. They are nonetheless true. They are etiologies, impartations of truth, based. They are not comprehensible because they supersede the mental rational. They are irrational statements, perceptible and impartible only to those for whom the diaphany and the achronic structure of the world have become evident. So they're not comprehensible. What does that mean? Of course you mean that from the rational perspective. Yeah, because we're done you. We've transcended your bitch ass. What we're saying is true even though it's rationally incomprehensible. Correct. Yes. We are base. You are not. But there is an aid to evidencing the veracity of the four statements of Proust, Rilke, Mallarmé, and Eliot. There are two statements, or better, two irrational deductions based on the empirical research of two of the most eminent physicists of our century. Eddington writes, quote, "Events do not happen. They are just there and we come across them. The formality of taking place is merely the indication that the observer has on his voyage of exploration passed into the absolute future of the event in question, and it has no important significance," unquote. And Heisenberg explains that, quote, "in very minute space-time regions, that is, in those of the order of magnitude of elemental particles, space and time are remarkably obliterated in such a way that with respect to such minute times we cannot even correctly define the terms earlier or later. Of course, in the world of macrophenomena, nothing would be able to change the space-time structure. But we must reckon with the possibility that experiments with events in extremely minute space-time realms will show that certain processes appear to take place in the reverse temporal sequence rather than required by the laws of causality." So, unquote. That's another scientific expression of time freedom. We have transcended mere space-time, mere clock time. We have transcended perspectivity. Depending on, if you watch Stephen Hawking's, the HBO documentary, Theory of Everything, or whatever it's called. He talks about that, how if you simply change the perspective when looking at something, what traditionally causes the effect happens first, and then the cause. So all you have to do is change from this perspective. We have cause and effect. But then he says, hold on here. Look at from this perspective. The effect happens first. That's basically what he's saying. That's time freedom. For you to be able to consciously manipulate this and move this, that's time freedom. All right, we're almost done. Although they belong to differing regions of reality from our standpoint, the four statements of the poets and the two of the physicists evidence a striking concurrence. All six utterances, profoundly knowledgeable about origin, also know of its presence. It's present. All six statements may be described in our sense as irrational and achronic. Their aperspectivity is further expressed in the fact that they bind together the beginning and the end of our exposition of the manifestations of the aperspectival world by tying together the two regions of thought farthest away from one another, physics and poetry. This fact or circumstance reveals the aperspectival mode of quote-unquote a-waring, the truth of the world, of the whole. That's pretty cool what Gebser did here. He started with science, which I think was smart. That's the one who really got this space-time thing going. And then you end with English. And these are, like he said, these are worlds apart. It's not that they don't have anything to do with each other. It's just, relatively speaking, they're not connected. The fact that you have these physicists and these great poets, great authors, great literary critics awakening the same time freedom and more or less saying the same thing, just with their own little spin on it, that says something. We have officially finished we have officially finished Manifestations of the Aperspectival World. I am proud of us, boys and girls. I am very proud of us. Thank you for your patience. I apologize if I've just been running on 120, 110% recently, and I hope it doesn't come out too much in the quality of the lectures. If they really are bad, let me know, and I will try to go back and I will redo it. I want you guys to have high-quality lectures. I apologize. I really appreciate your patience, and thank you guys for continuing. We are almost done. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel. You guys are the best. I will see you soon.